For our second talk for tonight, really delighted to have Ethar El-Katatney. Ethar and I were colleagues at the Wall Street Journal, where she was Young Audiences editor. She was also previously the executive producer at AJ Plus. And more recently, she's part of the inaugural cohort at the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism's executive program in news, innovation, and leadership. So really glad to have Ethar here tonight. She's going to tell us about her capstone project, which is about attracting young audiences, and I'll hand it over to her to tell you all about it. You're muted, Ethar.
Hi, everyone. It is so nice to not see any of you, just looking at a lot of black squares. Let me see if I can share my screen. Share screen. Okay. I am talking to you from San Francisco, where it is beautifully sunny and cold. All right. Can you all see my screen? Hopefully.
Yep.
Yes? Okay, great. Awesome. Okay, great. So I have 10 minutes to walk you through what is a 50-page guide, I guess, at this point. So I'll be very brief. So the title of my project is Attracting Young-ish Audiences, a guide for small-ish legacy organizations. My name is Ethar. Why did I decide to focus on this project for my research? Primarily because I've been doing young people content for at least the past decade, although I kind of object to the young people tag, but that's kind of what it falls into. So that's the full spectrum of all kinds of different formats, not just video, primarily for social, for online, for young people. Oops. Okay. I have been in journalism for the past 15 years. I've worked in magazines, TV, as a producer, presenter. I've done newspapers. And then, as Robin said, the last 8 years, I've been here in the United States, working primarily at AJ Plus and the Wall Street Journal. So this project that I've been working on, as he said, I'm part of a group, 16 people, 16 incredible people from 8 of us are from the United States, 8 people international, managing editor, at Financial Times, from Bloomberg, South Africa, and it's an executive program in news, innovation, and leadership. We each chose an area or a topic that we are particularly interested in to spend a few months working on. And I chose, given that over the years I've given so many trainings, getting this question all the time, how do we get young people to consume our content? How do we produce content for them? How do we target them? What kind of formats should be on? What platforms should we be on? How do we get them to pay us? How do we retain them? I kind of decided to really dig down and kind of work on a guide that is not too broad, but also not too specific, aiming for more smaller legacy organizations that are kind of trying to dip their toe into producing different kind of content for a newer audience, kind of helping them figure out how do they target, how do they segment, how do they decide what their content and storytelling should look like, what platforms should they be on, how they work on distribution, how they build community. And it is based on my experience, but also primarily tons of case studies from across the industry. None of this is revolutionary. A lot of it I've said in multiple trainings in multiple places. I will give a caveat that each one of these sections I've given trainings of upwards of 6 hours, like full day trainings on. So we're just gonna breeze on right through, give 30 seconds to each one, really just in bullet points. But what I'm really hoping makes this research kind of unique is it shows you how the advice across the industry, so from purely digital organizations like AJ Plus and now this, to a lot more traditional legacy organizations like the Financial Times, to some hybrid models, to see how the advice is actually shared. So you have, chemical and engineering news saying the same thing that BuzzFeed News is saying. So each section of my project kind of takes one of these aspects, goes into depth of how we tackle that, and then highlights it with a case study. And then one important thing to mention is we do not tackle monetization at all in this project, which obviously is a kind of cop out, but it was too big for the scope of the project. Okay, so 1 minute for each section. So by young audiences in this project, I defined it as Gen Z, which are between 96 to 2015, however you want to define it. So between 6 to 7 years old to 24 to 25. So the first thing my research was kind of showed is how important it is to really understand this audience, to really learn what defines them in terms of education, representation, demographics. You have to clearly define within that audience who it is you're trying to target. 18-year-old has very different problems and issues than 21-year-olds. Listening, one of the keywords throughout this entire project is listening, whether that's social listening or actually listening to what are the things they want to see represented. Listening was core. Trying to look beyond the stereotypes of, young people don't care about news, because actually they do, and they do consume it. They do consume it maybe a little bit differently, maybe a little bit more by osmosis and less intentionally, but they do. To hire them to actually employ the people who look like and represent the audiences that you're trying to target. To be very focused within your content. Don't try and do everything. Another key thing, which is if you try and do everything and be on every platform, you will fail. To respect the generation. This was something a lot of especially young people reflected to me, which is that they don't feel their issues and their concerns are taken seriously. And then being very clear about what you stand for as an organization. This is a generation that very much values authenticity, trust, and wants to know what you care about. And then I talked to a CEO of a Gen Z consulting company who was 22, started it at the age of 16. Throughout this presentation, I'll quickly give you quotes from each one. So he talked about wanting convenience, accessibility, representation, diversity, sustainability, purpose-driven content that is creative and innovative. What do you stand for? Give us something of value and mean what you say. Be authentic. Authenticity, also something that was talked about a lot. Content, I'm racing on through. I apologize, you can't interrupt me, but you can definitely disagree with me or send me questions later. So for the content you produce, it boils down to really figuring out what your unique selling proposition is as an organization. If you're trying to compete on news, you'll be in a really tough position. But every organization has obviously specific goals, specific ways of tackling whatever content they produce. And if you can really define and drill down what it is you offer that is different, what it is you offer that will appeal, you'll be in a really good position, especially if that is a niche topic or an area of expertise. Again, this is a generation that really values specific communities and plugging into niche topics. So if you can bring those together, then you're in a good spot. You need to be clear on what are you trying to do. Are you trying to grow audience? Are you trying to gain subscribers? Are you getting views? Are you looking at retention? What are kind of your goals with the new content that you're trying to produce? And then you have to produce content that resonates. So whether that's emotional content, character-driven content, that speaks to them as an individual, that is representation, that has representation of who they are. Representation comes up a lot in this. And then obviously involving them in that production. So involving them in thinking of the stories you want to do, having them highlight their voices in that. That is also something you focus on a lot. So Dory, who was executive editor at Vice, had this to say about content, which is choosing core interests that are aligned with the identity of Vice and with our audience. So they focused on counterculture, niche communities, identities, with intentional focus on finding stories from within those communities. And again, this is a theme that comes up a lot, especially with this generation, which is stories that accurately reflect them and highlight their voices. Okay, storytelling, it feels very fun to just be, all this work to just do it in 30 seconds versus, a few hours. If I would distill your storytelling first, in addition to listening, is another one of those keywords that comes up a lot, which is your storytelling is one of the most important parts of this whole equation. Again, it's not an equation, so it's not ABC, but your storytelling comes first. It comes before thinking of what format, right? Your story, this is one of the things Robin had mentioned in our interview, which is you ask what is the format that is the best way to tell the story. What platform does this story most work on? Not necessarily, that doesn't come first. The story comes first, and then the format, and then the platform. So to distill this, voices for me would really be the most important part, which is let them talk about their story, let them be the voice. You don't talk about them, let them speak for themselves. Be authentic, be down to earth, don't condescend, be emotive, be simple. Another thing this generation is they talk about people talk down to them, condescend to them, that, you know, they don't understand, but there's a big difference between being explanatory and trying to be very simplistic. So again, not to fall into the trap of being like, we have to only give them listicles for them to get it. So Almar is a co-founder of #OurStories, which is a small organization that really lets young people talk about their voices. She had a very cool Zoom background. So she talked about how when they started when they started #OurStories a few years ago, it was because they realized they weren't actually hearing young people's voices reflected, and they thought that could be what would differentiate them. We tell people's stories through their eyes, and that's the golden thread, that's the through line of all their storytelling. Okay, production, this is obviously, can get a little bit technical, so we're not gonna go into specifics. Obviously, we're not going into specifics of any of it, but in brief, production is huge. A lot of organizations put so much focus on the production, but I would actually say with the advent of so many tools and so many resources over the last few years, production is a lot easier than it used to be. You know, when I started at AJ Plus in 2013, there were only a handful of people producing video. We had editors, we had so many, it was much more intensive to produce the content that we did. So I would argue that production, obviously, still extremely important in order to be able to even stand out amidst the saturation, but it is no longer so impossible. You know, everybody on TikTok, every 16-year-old is an incredible editor and producer. So you have to take stock of your resources because this is expensive, and we're working on the premise in this guide that you already have at the very least buy-in from higher ups, and you have hopefully a small budget or, you know, a few producers, and you have to be very honest with yourself. Even though, again, we don't talk about monetization here, it's still important to think, do I actually have ability to produce any of these resources? Focus on a few, not every platform. Don't duplicate what you're actually doing already on your newspaper or on your website. Definitely think mobile first, because that's where they're consuming the content. Video is still king. And even if you're not doing video, visuals are extremely important. Your first shot is the most important if you're doing video. That's another key in according to listening, storytelling first. First shot is the most important, is another key thing to remember. Templates can make your life a lot easier, and other formats, obviously, you don't have to focus primarily on video. One great quote from John, who is currently senior executive producer at AJ Plus, is that amazing footage needs minimal production. It's like cooking meat. Good steak doesn't need much seasoning. Bad one needs lots of it. Let your content speak for itself. And I just wanted to throw this in because I thought it was hilarious of how a young person, how he films videos for TikTok and YouTube. So portrait mode and also shooting vertically. And I just thought that was hilarious. So just also things we keep in mind. More stuff on production, the importance of experimenting and innovation, the importance of working in teams. From the previous session, I think it's great how, you know, working in silos never works. Embedding people within different teams and bringing in those skill sets definitely helps bring so much creativity and alternative ways of thinking of how we work. Focusing on engagement first. Engagement, getting your audience to engage with your content, no matter how you define that in terms of metric, whether that's sharing or commenting, is one of the key ways of getting that content to be amplified. Have very clear workflows of how your audience team works with your social team, works with your producers, even if that's all even the same person. Test your content always, test your captions, test your thumbnails. Creating a sub-brand doesn't always work for everybody, but it's also one alternative way to think of what we do. 2 minutes. Really important. I have 2 quotes on the importance of actually putting young people and social platform editors in charge, because I thought it was just so critical. They know what they're doing. Give them the autonomy, give them the freedom. Their creativity will really show itself. And Deblina, who's also at CNN, resonated the same thing, which is let the people in the room who know what they're doing take the lead, let them step up, because they're on those platforms. They know what they're doing. Listen to them. Off-platform production, again, so much to get into here, but it boils down to the importance about understanding behaviors on each platform, understanding that you have to produce platforms specifically for each platform. You cannot just duplicate the content. And there's possibility of having some hybrid models. If you're not just on social, you have your own website, you have your own newsletters, ways of bringing those together. But again, each way needs its own strategy. Versha, who's at Now This, senior correspondent and managing editor, obviously tells us it costs a lot of money to be on these platforms, a lot of resources, difficult to monetize. Facebook doesn't really share, but you have to understand, and she would advise to put resources into researching how their behaviors change, experiment, prioritize engagement. And then last 2 things, your distribution process has to be built in from the beginning. You have to think of everything from your captions to your timing to your thumbnails. Do you repost this content? Look at your data analytics all the time. And one thing which obviously isn't always possible, which is to offer your content for free. And then the last thing is community, core component of how you build that audience. How do you engage with them? Build partnerships, commission external content, work with influencers, which is obviously a huge component of this generation, who are less so about celebrities and reality TV stars and more about people like them, who they follow. And events is one part. In my project, I go into like specifically NPR, which had a great example of how they used events to build community, because again, bringing those people into your audience, producing with them, not for them, is key way to get them to watch. Storytelling first is my mantra. And then last thing from Riyadh, which I thought just kind of summed it up, which is, generation that wakes up, they look at their phone, they move from entertained to laughing to crying to learning a new skill in 3 minutes. So you have to understand them and give them specifically something that is just for them. Thank you guys. Sorry I had to race through that, but hopefully I'll be publishing this soon, and we can discuss more.
Great, thank you so much, and lots of information and useful tips in there. We have a couple of questions coming in. So Jackie asks if you have an example of one smallish legacy brand that you think has been doing a really good job at this, has been really successful at reaching out to young people.
So I actually end my whole project, great question, because I can give them a shout out by actually highlighting one organization that I think did a great job at this, and it was Chemical and Engineering News. You would be amazed, I was too. They have done a phenomenal job in the last few years of really highlighting that niche expertise they have, of choosing a very specific platform, producing content for that, hiring the exact right person, bringing in their audience, competitions, Zoom baking chemistry quizzes, a school e-course, really experimenting and innovating. Thanks, Frida. I can send you the template if you like. I can look through the others. The last year of lockdowns and distancing from Richard. Obviously it's affected everything, but one thing that was highlighted from my research, which is that it's actually given a lot of organizations a better chance in terms of production, right? Because we all had to go back to Skype interviews, right? Like all of my interviews were via Zoom. We don't have beautiful cinematography. Like I had $30,000 of wonderful equipment at WSJ Robin. It's all just sitting in an office somewhere. So it's given a lot more opportunity for reach and doing a lot more kinds of stories that we couldn't do before. To fake what's the best way to fake the required authenticity from Andrew? Hopefully not. Hopefully not to fake it. Language and style came a lot to play, especially with a little bit more legacy organizations who have, very specific guides when it comes to tone, how they present their objectivity, and this being a generation that's a little bit more doesn't want that middle of the line journalism. They want you to be clear on what you stand for. So I think it's not impossible to be authentic. Sometimes you're a little bit formal with some legacy organization, but finding that kind of middle ground. Don't go all in on something that you don't believe in, obviously, but find the things that you believe in that are kind of that tangent, that Venn diagram between you and this generation. And that's the way you'll be able to connect to them. Which I guess filters into Deb's question, which is young audiences, how do you ensure a balance along authenticity, which often relies on an individual? Great question, really difficult to answer because it was brought up a lot, which is, again, how do we value people and how do we do when reporters, for example, aren't allowed to have a voice online, right? Think of the Washington Post. They've done a great job on TikTok by allowing, their reporter to be on there, but a lot of organizations make it clear, that our reporters are producers, you can't be online, you can't produce, and not really seeing that they've become part of your brand and that translates into your voice and to what you stand for this generation. So it's again, it's also hard to balance, and I found the best way is to be very clear on editorial priorities as an organization. Like, here are the issues that we care about, that this target audience cares about, and then that allows us to be able to do it without any kind of friction. But yeah, it's very tough.
And presumably, and this links to Jacob's question as well about sort of best practices for working with influencers.
Yeah.
Presumably, besides editorial priorities, also sort of processes and sort of the rigors of fact checking and sort of the work that you do to do due diligence and verify facts as well.
Oh yeah, it's super important. BuzzFeed News, who I talked to in this, was a really great example because they created a whole project kind of just wanting to get like teen influencers slash reporters. And kind of Sarah had walked me through their vetting process and being very selective in not just jumping on like, oh, this person has a great following, because obviously they fall into that same, oh, well, if they work for you, then they're producing content for you, and should they be under the same standards as when we hire, for example, externally, but they're not reporters. So definitely creating your own set of kind of guidelines, and how you go about doing that, whether it's crowdsourced information, the same way we have kind of rules over like our user generated content and how do we vet the people behind it. It's kind of similar to that. But again, I would also say that choosing your influencers based on your goals, like what are you trying to do? Is it an influencer because they're on this platform, or is it an influencer because they're in that niche topic? What's the reason you want to bring in this person? And then you still have to do the legwork behind to make sure that they are aligned with your organization and won't come up, and surprise you with other things.